A US military white paper being published by the Air Force Laboratory is coming under some heavy criticism for making some fairly contentious statements, unsubstantiated statements about Islamic extremism and the rationale and the reasons why certain Muslims have a predilection towards Islamic extremism. The two most contentious arguments, when I get into them, are that sexual deprivation creates militancy and creates these young men who wish to become suicide bombers, most specifically. And I'll take the second one first, that wearing religious garb, specifically the hijab, is a form of passive terrorism. So, Mark, as I said, I'm going to take the second one of those first because it seems the most egregious, the most ridiculous and unsubstantiated. This is what the author of this paper has said. He says, extremism occurs when increasing numbers of women begin to wear the hijab, which is both a symptom of Salafi proliferation, we'll get to what that means in a second, and a catalyst for Islamism. In turn, the proliferation of militant Salafism and the hijab contribute to the idea of passive terrorism, which occurs when moderate segments of the population decline to speak against or actively resist terrorism. So this is Salafi Islam is sort of like the hard line form of interpretation of Islam. And they're saying that what he's saying is that there is a direct correlation, even though he produces no evidence, there is a direct correlation between wearing the hijab and an acceptance, if you will, of terrorism. So this idea of passive terrorism.
I don't understand the connection at all. I'm still stuck on the whole idea that terrorists are created by not getting enough sex.
Well, we'll come to that. We'll come to that in a second. The chapter is written by a guy called Dr. Tawfik Hamid, who himself is a self-confessed former extremist. He's from the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. He wrote this paper in 2011. And it's been republished. The controversy is coming around because it's been recently republished last summer under a directive from the administration that we needed to try to counter violent extremism. So there's a whole raft of papers that have been put forward, and this is a chapter in that publication. And it is causing a lot of controversy because of these unsubstantiated, inflammatory views. My views on this matter are that in an age where there is such virulent anti-Islamic sentiment, unsubstantiated, the fear-mongering, the scaremongering, papers such as this, which are which have the legitimacy of the US military behind it, are so desperately unhelpful in the dialogue, purely because there's no proof to it. This guy sounds like a sort of angry blogger, and it happens to have his document published.
What is the motive then in the army putting this out, and who is it getting put out to? Who's the audience for this? The
audience will be government officials. The audience will be other military. It's part of the military what they do in terms of their initiatives.
Right. So does this shape the conditioning of the soldier on the ground towards women in these countries, so that it sort of dehumanizes them or somehow makes them become terrorists in the mind of the American soldier?
What it's doing is, right, I mean, that's right. And what it's doing is accentuating those differences and accentuating those cultural, religious differences and idiosyncrasies, which you can have whatever views you want on those, and I'm not going to get into that at this time, and actually making it the root of the problem, and actually rather than trying to build bridges and rather than try to really understand the problem, is actually just making sweeping generalizations. Case in point, Mark, in terms of the sexual frustration of these young men, he goes on, speaking from my own experience with the radical groups, I believe young Muslims are motivated to join radical groups because of sexual deprivation. That is so grotesquely simplistic, I don't even know where to begin.
If that were true, then married men across the United States would be blowing themselves up left and right.
Yeah, the lap dance bars would go out of business, and everyone would be strapping Semtex to themselves. Yeah. You're quite right, quite rightly said. It's just troubling that this has re-entered the public domain. It's troubling that this is something that hasn't really been vetted. This particular individual, as I said, he claims to have some legitimacy because he was a former extremist, but really his views are so simplistic. There's also we don't have the picture, but there's a flow chart really of like the road to extremism. And we know on this show, we've sat here and scratched our heads and tried to understand. There is no doubt There is a phenomenon where young men, particularly from Western Europe, young men feel so ostracized by mainstream society that they are going and joining ISIS.
Yes.
That is true. But to try to make sense of that and try to understand that is such a complex problem. And just to say that they're just young guys going through teenage angst and therefore they want to go blow themselves up.
And they're blaming the women, basically. The women are holding out. They're not allowed to have sex, and so it's turning them into extremists. Not the fact that there's a country on the other side of the world coming over and overthrowing their government and dropping bombs on their families. How about that for creating extremists?
Right. And also, it comes back to this point that we were talking about before, is that ISIS in of itself is a symptom rather than a root cause, but is a symptom of the conflict and the civil war in Syria. And that, as Mark alluded to, that destabilization of that regime, ISIS grew out of that. It is a symptom of that. It is not the root cause of that problem. And so as a consequence, if we can see it through that filter, that ISIS in of itself would not have occurred, would not have come to pass, would not have had the power that it had without that destabilization of that regime, then we can actually start to understand it, and then we can perhaps start to address it. So my point being, the solution is not to eviscerate ISIS and just wipe them off the planet, because that's not how they were created in the first place. The solution, as we advocated a number of times, or I certainly have advocated, is a diplomatic one. Easier said than done, but is a diplomatic one. And so comments like this in white papers coming out by the government are just desperately unhelpful.
Or
you want to say
just
something?
get them more sex.
Or perhaps, well, and that's what he comes back to. And you say it flippantly, but what Dr. Hamid says is because of the promise of these virgins. Of the virgins when they get to the promised land. That is why they're doing it. He makes that causal link. It's so overly simplistic. He has the legitimacy because he was a self-confessed former extremist. But one hopes that this is something that will be debunked very rapidly, and people who read it will be discerning. But to Mark's point, if it enters the public consciousness or if it enters the military psyche in any way, then that is very, very damaging and ultimately is extremely unhelpful.